Open your Bible to the very last page of the Old Testament, and then turn one more page. On one side of that page sits the prophet Malachi, closing out a story that began in a garden. On the other side sits Matthew, opening a story with the birth of a child in a stable. Between those two pages, nothing. No verse. No chapter. Not even a footnote. But in the actual history of the world, that blank space holds roughly 400 years. Empires rise and fall in that gap. A language changes. A temple gets destroyed and rebuilt, then desecrated, then fought over street by street. Historians call this stretch the intertestamental period. Most people just call it the 400 silent years. Silent doesn't mean empty. It means no prophet stood up during this entire stretch and said, "Thus says the Lord," the way Isaiah or Jeremiah once did. But the world did not go quiet. If anything, it got louder than it had been in centuries. A 18-year-old king from Macedonia marched an army across 3 continents. A Greek-speaking library in Egypt tried to collect every book on earth, including the Hebrew scriptures. A tyrant put a statue of Zeus on the altar of the Jewish temple, and a family of priests picked up hammers instead of pens. A Roman general walked into the most sacred room in Jerusalem, uninvited, just to see what was inside. And by the time an angel finally speaks again on the very first page of Matthew, the entire political map, the entire language, and the entire religious landscape of Judea had been rebuilt from the ground up. This is the story of what happened while God, as far as anyone recorded, said nothing at all. The book of Malachi doesn't end with a comforting farewell. It ends with a warning. The prophet accuses the priests of offering God their leftovers, blind, lame, diseased animals, the sacrifices nobody else wanted. He accuses the people of robbing God through neglected offerings, and of growing cynical about whether serving God was even worth it anymore. And then, in its final verses, the book makes a promise instead of a threat. Before the great and terrible day of the Lord arrives, God says, He will send the prophet Elijah again, someone to turn the hearts of parents and children back toward each other. Then the book simply stops. At the time Malachi was writing, somewhere around 430 BC, Judea was a small, unremarkable province inside the enormous Persian Empire. The Jews had already returned from exile in Babylon. The temple had already been rebuilt, smaller and humbler than Solomon's original. The priesthood was functioning. The law of Moses was being read. On paper, everything looked restored. But restored isn't the same as thriving. Judea was poor, small, and easy to overlook, a minor administrative district paying taxes to a king most of its people would never see. For the next 100 years or so, almost nothing about that changes. Persian governors come and go. Life in Jerusalem continues in a kind of quiet, unremarkable rhythm. The Persian kings, to their credit, generally left local religion alone across their enormous empire, and Judea was no exception. Sacrifices continued. Festivals continued. The line of high priests continued. It's easy to imagine this stretch as uneventful, almost sleepy, a small mountain province quietly copying scrolls and tending its rebuilt altar while the wider world went about its business elsewhere. That illusion of permanence was about to be shattered, and not by anything happening in Judea itself. Far to the northwest, in the kingdom of Macedonia, a boy was growing up under the tutelage of the philosopher Aristotle, being groomed by his father for a throne and a war against Persia that his father would never live to fight himself. Then, in 334 BC, that boy, now a young king, crosses into Asia with an army, and the quiet ends for good. Alexander of Macedon was 20 years old when he inherited his father's throne, and barely older than that when he set out to dismantle the entire Persian Empire. He moved fast. Within a few years, he had broken Persian power at Granicus, taken the coastal cities of Phoenicia, and turned south toward Egypt. Along that route sat Judea, small and defenseless, directly in the path of the most successful military campaign the ancient world had ever seen. Jewish tradition, recorded generations later by the historian Josephus, describes what supposedly happened next. According to the story, Alexander had already demanded that Jerusalem transfer its loyalty and its taxes away from the Persian king and toward him. The Jewish high priest, a man named Jadis, refused. He had sworn an oath of loyalty to the Persian king, and while that king still lived, he intended to keep it. Furious, Alexander marched toward Jerusalem, apparently intending to make an example of the city. The high priest, terrified, is said to have gathered the priests in their full ceremonial robes and gone out to meet the approaching army at the city gates rather than wait behind them. And then, according to the legend, something unexpected happened. When Alexander saw the high priest in his priestly garments, he dismounted and bowed before him. His own officers were stunned. This conqueror bowed to no one. When they asked why, Alexander is said to have explained that he had seen this very man, dressed exactly this way, in a dream before he ever left Macedonia, promising him victory over Persia. Whether or not the story happened exactly this way, the outcome is not in dispute. Jerusalem was spared. The temple was left untouched. The Jews were allowed to continue observing their own laws. But something else came through the gates with Alexander that would prove far harder to keep out than an army: the Greek language, Greek gymnasiums, Greek theater, Greek philosophy, Greek gods. Historians call this cultural wave Hellenism, and once it entered the Near East, it never fully left again. Alexander died young, only 8 years after entering Jerusalem, without a clear heir. His generals spent the next few decades fighting each other over the pieces, and Judea found itself squeezed between two of the resulting kingdoms, the Ptolemies, ruling from Egypt, and the Seleucids, ruling from Syria. For roughly a century, Judea belonged to the Ptolemies. And it was under their rule that something happened to the Hebrew scriptures that would change how most of the ancient world would eventually read them. Alexandria, Egypt, had become the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Its ruler, Ptolemy II, wanted the city's library to hold a copy of every important book that existed anywhere, an almost obsessive ambition for total knowledge. The Hebrew scriptures were on that list. There was just one problem. Almost no one in Alexandria could read Hebrew anymore. A growing Jewish community had settled there over generations, and their children increasingly grew up speaking Greek as their first language, the way immigrant communities often do. So, according to Jewish tradition, Ptolemy sent word to the high priest in Jerusalem requesting scholars capable of translating the Hebrew Torah into Greek. 72 scholars are said to have made the journey to Egypt, 6 chosen from each of the 12 tribes, to complete the work. The resulting Greek translation became known as the Septuagint, a name that simply nods to that traditional number of 70 translators. Over the following generations, the rest of the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek as well, book by book. This wasn't just a technical convenience for a diaspora community that had lost its Hebrew. It reshaped how an entire ancient civilization could access these texts. For the first time, a Greek-speaking Egyptian, a Greek-speaking Roman, or a Greek-speaking anyone could pick up a scroll and read the story of Genesis, the poetry of the Psalms, the warnings of the prophets, no Hebrew required. The project reportedly took place on the island of Pharos, just offshore from Alexandria, where later generations of Alexandrian Jews are said to have held an annual celebration marking the day the translation was finished. By the time the New Testament writers were composing their own Greek texts a few centuries later, it was this Greek Old Testament, not the original Hebrew, that most of them were quoting from directly. Paul's letters, written to Greek-speaking congregations scattered across the Roman world, lean on this same Greek translation again and again, because it was the version his readers actually owned and could read for themselves. A translation commissioned to satisfy a king's curiosity about a library ended up shaping how the earliest Christians would read their own scriptures. But the peace that allowed a project like the Septuagint to happen at all wouldn't last. Control of Judea eventually passed from the Ptolemies to their rivals in the north, the Seleucids, and one Seleucid king in particular was about to turn Jerusalem into a battlefield. His name was Antiochus IV, and he gave himself the title Epiphanes, God made manifest. Not everyone agreed with his own assessment. Some of his contemporaries quietly called him Epimanes instead, the madman, a one-letter joke at the expense of a very dangerous man. Antiochus wanted something Alexander had never demanded outright, total cultural and religious conformity across his empire, Judea included. He banned the Sabbath. He banned circumcision, the ancient sign of the covenant with Abraham. He ordered the sacred Hebrew scrolls confiscated and destroyed wherever they could be found. Owning a copy of the law, or circumcising your own son, could now be punished with death. Officers were sent from town to town to enforce these decrees directly, sometimes holding monthly inspections to make sure no household had quietly kept its old customs alive. Mothers were executed for having their infant sons circumcised. Elderly teachers were killed for refusing to eat food forbidden under Jewish law, choosing death over even a symbolic act of disobedience to their own tradition. And in 167 BC, Antiochus went further than any previous ruler ever had. He marched into the Jerusalem temple itself, walked to the altar of burnt offering, and set up a statue of the Greek god Zeus on top of it. Then he ordered a pig sacrificed there, an animal considered thoroughly unclean under Jewish law, on the holiest altar in the Jewish world. To later Jewish writers, this act had a name straight out of the prophet Daniel, the abomination of desolation, the ultimate defilement of the one place on earth set apart as holy. For a deeply religious population that had endured exile, rebuilding, and generations of foreign rule without ever losing their temple's basic sanctity, this was unbearable. The breaking point came in a small village called Modian, where an aging priest named Mattathias was ordered to offer a pagan sacrifice in public, as an example to the surrounding villages. Mattathias refused. When another Jewish man stepped forward to perform the sacrifice in his place, Mattathias killed him on the spot, then killed the king's officer sent to enforce the order. It was an act of open rebellion, and there was no walking it back. Mattathias and his 5 sons fled into the hills, and what began as one furious priest's refusal turned into a full-scale revolt. Leadership of the revolt fell to one of Mattathias's sons, a fighter named Judah, who earned the nickname Maccabeus, most likely meaning, the hammer. Against a professional Seleucid army, Judah's forces were badly outnumbered and poorly equipped. By any conventional military logic, the revolt should have been crushed within a season. Instead, using speed, terrain, and sheer desperation, the Maccabees won battle after battle against Seleucid forces sent to put them down. In 164 BC, roughly 3 years after the desecration, Judah and his fighters finally recaptured Jerusalem and the Temple Mount itself. What they found waiting for them was devastating. The sanctuary stood empty and defiled, its gates burned, weeds growing where the courts had once been swept clean. Rather than simply resume worship, they tore down the desecrated altar entirely and built a new one from unhewn stones, refusing to let even the pagan altar's foundation remain. They stored the broken stones from the old altar off to the side, unwilling to reuse them but also unwilling to simply discard something that had once stood in the temple, however defiled it had since become. New sacred vessels had to be made from scratch, since so much had been looted or destroyed during the years of occupation, and new curtains had to be woven to replace what had been torn down. According to later tradition, when the time came to relight the temple's sacred lamp, the priests could find only a single small jar of ritually pure oil, barely enough to last 1 day. The story says that small amount of oil miraculously burned for 8 full days, exactly the time needed to prepare a fresh, properly consecrated supply. That 8-day memory became the origin of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, still celebrated by Jewish families today, roughly 22 centuries after the events it commemorates. Antiochus never got to see his intended cultural conquest of Judea fail. He died on a military campaign in the east, his health and his empire both collapsing around the same time. The Maccabee family didn't stop at simply reclaiming the temple. Over the following decades, they pushed for full political independence, eventually founding their own ruling dynasty, the Hasmoneans. For about 80 years, incredibly, Judea governed itself. A tiny, previously conquered province had fought off an empire and briefly become a kingdom again in its own right. It wouldn't last. The very independence the Hasmoneans had won would eventually collapse from the inside, in a family feud that would hand Judea over to a far larger power altogether. By the 60s BC, the Hasmonean dynasty had curdled into exactly what it had once fought against: two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, locked in a civil war over the throne, both willing to bring in outside help to defeat the other. Hyrcanus was the older, milder brother, more comfortable as a ceremonial high priest than a warrior. Aristobulus was younger, ambitious, and had already seized the throne once by force. Neither brother had the strength to finish off the other alone, so both eventually appealed to outside powers for backing, each hoping foreign muscle would tip the balance permanently in his favor. The outside help they turned to was Rome, and Rome was only too happy to get involved. The Roman general Pompey, already the most powerful military figure of his generation, marched into the region to settle the dispute, and, predictably, to settle it in Rome's own favor. In the summer of 63 BC, after a siege lasting several months, Roman forces broke into Jerusalem and the temple grounds. Thousands of defenders were killed in the fighting. Then Pompey did something that shocked the Jewish population even more than the military defeat itself. He walked into the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, so sacred that Jewish law permitted only the high priest to enter it, and only once a year. Pompey wasn't performing a religious ritual. He was simply curious. Ancient rumors claimed this secret Jewish inner sanctum held some hidden idol or treasure, and he apparently wanted to see it for himself. He found the room essentially empty, no statue, no image of any god, nothing but bare space around the ark's former resting place. To his credit, by most historical accounts, Pompey took nothing from the temple's treasures and ordered its normal worship resumed the very next day. But the political message was unmistakable. Judea's brief century of self-rule was over. From this point forward, the region existed at Rome's pleasure, not its own. The Hasmonean dynasty limped on for a little while longer in a diminished, largely ceremonial form, while real power increasingly shifted toward men willing to work directly with their new Roman patrons. One of those men had a son who was about to become the most consequential ruler Judea would see before the arrival of Rome's own version of a king from Bethlehem. His name was Herod, and almost nothing about his rise to power was traditional. He wasn't from the priestly line. He wasn't even fully Jewish by ancestry. His family came from Idumea, the region the Old Testament calls Edom, descendants of a people the Jewish scriptures had a long and complicated history with. What Herod had instead of pedigree was ambition, political instinct, and a talent for staying useful to whichever Roman faction currently held power. In 40 BC, the Roman Senate formally declared him King of the Jews, a title handed to him in Rome, by Romans, years before he actually controlled Jerusalem itself. It took him 3 more years of fighting to make that title a reality on the ground. Once he was securely in power, Herod proved to be exactly what history remembers him as: brilliant, paranoid, and often brutal, sometimes within the very same week. He was a builder on a genuinely staggering scale. He constructed the port city of Caesarea Maritima essentially from nothing. He built the mountain fortress of Masada. He renovated entire cities across his kingdom in the latest Roman art. His single greatest project was the Jerusalem temple itself. Herod tore down the smaller, humbler structure the returning exiles had built centuries earlier and replaced it with an immense architectural marvel, one of the largest religious complexes anywhere in the ancient world. It's this vastly expanded, Herod built temple that appears throughout the Gospels, the one Jesus would later walk through, teach in, and ultimately clash with the authorities over. But the same man who built that temple was also consumed by suspicion of anyone who might threaten his throne, including members of his own family. Over the years, Herod had several of his own sons executed on suspicion of plotting against him, along with his favorite wife. The Roman Emperor Augustus is said to have remarked, with dark humor, that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, since Herod's own Jewish dietary customs meant a pig, at least, wasn't at risk of being killed by him. Even his grandest building project carried a kind of political calculation. A magnificent temple bought him goodwill from a Jewish population that never fully trusted an Idumean king wearing a Jewish crown. He surrounded that same temple with Roman-style architecture, a fortress overlooking its courts, and, briefly, controversially, a golden eagle mounted above one of its gates, a Roman symbol some pious Jews considered dangerously close to the same kind of idolatry that. By the end of his life, Herod was old, ill, and more paranoid than ever, ruling a kingdom he had built almost entirely through Roman favor and his own relentless will. This is the ruler, paranoid and powerful in almost equal measure, who was still sitting on Judea's throne when the very first page of the New Testament finally opens. Step back and look at everything that happened in this so-called silence. A conquering king reshaped the entire region's language and culture within a single generation. Scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into the common language of the ancient world, making them accessible to millions of people who could never have read them otherwise. A tyrant defiled the temple, and a family of ordinary priests picked up weapons rather than accept it, eventually winning back a kingdom that had been lost for centuries. Rome arrived, uninvited, and permanently changed who actually held power in Judea. And a builder king with blood on his hands and one of the ancient world's most impressive temples to his name was still ruling when the silence finally ended. Because it does end. Turn that last blank page of your Bible, and Matthew's Gospel opens with an angel appearing to a man named Joseph, and shortly afterward, to a group of shepherds in a field outside Bethlehem. The very last verses of the Old Testament had promised that a messenger, in the spirit of Elijah, would come before the great day of the Lord arrived. For 400 years, as far as anyone recorded, that promise simply sat there, unfulfilled and seemingly forgotten. Then a childless, elderly priest named Zechariah walked into the temple to burn incense, the same temple Herod had spent decades rebuilding, and an angel was standing there waiting for him. The silence wasn't God doing nothing. Underneath the surface, an entire world had been rebuilt, translated, conquered, and fought over, all of it setting the stage, piece by piece, for a single birth in a small, unremarkable town in everything this study has walked through. The Greek language spoken in Nazareth's marketplaces, the Roman roads that would later carry the Apostle Paul across the empire, even Herod's own rebuilt temple where an infant Jesus would one day be presented, all of it was quietly put in place. 400 years of empires and revolts and rebuilt temples, and it all comes down to one page, in one book, where the quiet finally, quietly, breaks.